Hey everybody, welcome back to Pizza Legends. Today we're going to focus on the pause menu. We're going to start by putting a menu on screen that stops all the action while it's present, and then we're going to wire up that menu to make changes on our player state. As always, all the code and the whole playlist is linked below. Let's get started. So let's get started by making a new JavaScript file for our pause menu. It'll be another one of these components that we've been making. So pause menu JS, here comes our class. I'll fill in some of our usual things here, like our constructor, our init method, create element. Our constructor is going to receive an onComplete callback, just like we've seen before. That's going to be called when we're done pausing the menu, like when we want to unpause. And so we'll assign that to the class here. For create element, I'm just going to bring in some code that does a kind of our usual pattern. So we'll create a new element. It's going to be of type div. It's going to have a class name called pause menu that matches our JavaScript class name exactly. The inner HTML is just going to start with one of these H2s, but later on we're going to dynamically inject one of those keyboard menus, and those will end up going right here. Now when we init, we can go ahead and start running some of these methods. So we'll do create element, init brings in a container. We'll create our keyboard menu. We'll be adding a new piece of configuration here in a second, but for now, let's just move on. We can init that keyboard menu, passing in the element, and then we need to provide our first wave of options. So we'll call set options, just an empty array for now. Now the pause menu is going to be a lot like our battle submission menu, where we're going to be calling set options multiple times as you change pages. Just for getting this started and on screen though, let's just leave it like an empty array for now. We can take our container and append the child of our element. And so while we're here, we're going to also add a key binding that's going to allow us to close the pause menu. In most of the events we've seen so far, the events are ended when you choose a specific option or complete a submission in the menu, that kind of thing. This menu is going to be a little bit special in the sense that you're going to be able to just hit the escape key at any time to close it. So we'll add a new binding using our key press listener helper that we made a while back. Listen for that escape key. And whenever this escape key is pressed, we can run a new method called close. And we'll kind of add it up here. But the thing is, we want to be a little bit careful because if we start listening for this escape key right away, escape is also how we're going to open the pause menu. And so that same key press of opening the menu may also fire here to close it right away, which is not what we want. So instead, we're going to introduce just a tiny delay before we start listening for this. So we'll use our helper wait. And then because of that, we need to make this async. So let's shift gears and talk about this. Like I said a second ago, this menu is going to show different options at different times. And so let's create a new method that kind of gives us a space to do the logic for that. So we'll make a new method called getOptions, and we can pass in like a page key. And so in set options, we'll call this dot getOptions. And first we'll pass in root here, which tells us we want kind of that home page of options. That's going to be a list of all of our pizzas and a few other things that we'll add later. So I'll say if page key is root. So eventually here we're going to have like all of our pizzas, and these will be dynamic. But after those, we're going to have two static options. The first one is going to be our ability to save the game. So anytime you can pause, hit the save option, and it'll save your progress. We'll cover that later, but here's where the option is going to be. Then we'll also create an option just for closing the menu here. So if you don't want to hit escape again, you can just manually click this one. So that'll be close. The handler here will just fire the same thing that our escape key does. So that's this dot close. Bring this right here. Okay, let's add our JavaScript file to the project. So under HUD, we'll just add pause menu. Oh, dang, it looks like I added this to the wrong spot, but that's okay. We can fix it. While we're in the styles directory, I'm going to make a new style sheet for us to use. And normally we would do like pause menu.css to match, But in the next few videos, we're going to make a few different types of menus that are going to reuse a lot of styles. And so I'm just going to make kind of a more generic file called menus.css. And we'll come back to this. Let's move our pause menu.js file. So I'll take this and drag it. And now this should be all good. Let's add our style sheet up here. Okay, I believe we've straightened that out, so we should be all good now. Let's go ahead and try to get this component on screen when we hit that escape key. So I'll go to the Overworld Js file. And here, a while back, we added an enter handler for the action key. Let's do the same thing, but for escape. So we're going to kind of channel what's happening here, where this method and the enter key is going to go out and look for events at a certain space. We're going to also kind of do that, except we're just going to provide the events directly. And so when we hit the escape key, we can ask if there's no cutscene playing. We're going to go ahead and play a cutscene using one event, and that event's type is going to be pause. So it's kind of like we're creating a cutscene out of thin air. It's only going to do one thing, and that's the pause action. So let's handle this event type. So I'll go into our overworld event file. We're going to make a new one here. Before we go any further here, let's just make sure this whole thing is working. So I'll add a console log here. I'll run the game and open the console. When I hit the escape key, you see pause now appears. And now I can't do anything because under the hood, a cutscene event is running. That's the new pause event. And so all the other action has stopped. But there's some nuance here. If I pause the game while the character's walking, let's see that now. It happened pretty quick there, but the character actually finished his walking cycle in the middle of that pause event happening. So let's add a way for us to stop our game objects from updating while that pause menu is present. So let's take a look at Overworld JS here. In this file, there's this method called start game loop. And that's creating the step function and then every animation frame firing it off again. What we want to do here is add a check to see if we should actually fire it off again. So basically, if the map is paused, we want to not fire it off again. Whenever it's time to unpause, we can just fire this method and then the action will resume. So above the part where we recall it, I'm going to say this.map is paused. And if that's false, this is a new flag that we'll create on the map itself. If that's false, then it's cool to refire the step. If it's true, then the action will stop here, and then we can go ahead and just call start game loop again when we're ready for it to resume. So let's go ahead and create this on the map. So that's overworld map. We'll go ahead and add a new flag up here in the constructor called this.isPause. It can start false. And now in our overworld event, we'll add this flag here that's going to set that flag to true. Now when I'm walking around, I'll stop him mid-frame like this. And everything is frozen. It definitely feels like the game is paused. Now we can start putting that menu that we created on screen. So here comes the code for creating an instance of that pause menu. We'll say menu is a new pause menu. It needs that onComplete callback. When this happens, we can simply just resolve the event, but then of course we want to unpause our map. After we've unpaused it, we'll go ahead and kick off the game loop again. So we have a reference to the overworld there. We can say start game loop. We can add it to the scene now. So we'll run init, passing in our DOM element that we want to inject the menu into. So that's going to be game container. Clean this up. We can get rid of this too. Let's look at that pause menu again. And we can fill in some of this closing code. Where basically we need to do some cleanup to make sure all this stuff goes away properly. And then we can finally call this like on complete event to resume the action. So here, if we have this escape binding, which we created down here, we'll go ahead and run that unbind method on it. Take our keyboard menu and end it. We'll take our DOM element that houses the whole menu and just remove it. And then finally, yeah, let's call that on complete callback. You can see that the work we did before on making these helpers is really starting to pay off, where we can get these menus and stuff working pretty quickly. Now when I pause the game, we see some DOM elements have been injected to the screen. They're not styled properly yet. We'll do that in a second. But the loop has stopped up here. I have a working keyboard menu that is hover enabled and all that still here. When I unpause, everything unmounts properly too. So I can really just walk around and keep hitting escape. Again, it's kind of silly without the styles. And our close option here is also wired up to fire that same method. So here we go. Let's make this look a little bit more presentable now. Let's open that menus file that we created. I want to bring in some styles here. First, like we've seen before, we want the menu kind of on top of the screen. So we'll absolute position it. This time we're going to use left and right to make it sort of stretch out to cover most of the screen. We've used our theming variables here for background color and border. Just some z-index to make sure everything layers on top. And then finally some padding here for some cushion. I didn't use the shorthand here because I kept kind of tweaking the values independently. Ended up with this. You can make it look like whatever you want though. Next, we're going to target that keyboard menu inside pause menu and reset it to be position relative and to remove the border. Keyboard menu comes with a little bit of appearance out of the box, but we're going to get rid of that and just sort of integrate it into this container here. And then finally, some basic styles on the H2. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, so now I'll pause the game. We're getting closer. It's on screen. It's starting to look a little bit like something, but there's a little bit of weirdness here where our description bar is stuck inside that pause menu container, but really we want it to hug the bottom of the game screen kind of down here. So let's add in a little bit more flexibility where we can choose where that description bar should go. So back in pause menu JS, let's come down to the bit where we created the keyboard menu. I'm going to pass in a new option. This is going to be called description container. It's basically going to allow us to specify where we want that description bar to sit, like which element it should be injected into. And so for us, that's going to be the main game screen, the same thing that the menu itself is going into. So we'll say container here. So let's go to keyboard menu and make sure this is filled out and ready to accept this kind of option. So we'll go to keyboard menu JS. And currently it doesn't accept any configuration. And so we'll fix that now. If this isn't provided, we can just default to an object. And so we'll say this dot description container is going to be whatever was passed in or null if we didn't get anything. And now down here, when we actually inject the description container, that's happening right here. We'll go ahead and just kind of flesh this part out a little bit more to say that if we have a description container, we want to inject into that. But if we don't have one, then you can just default to container. And up here, let's make sure we use config. Now when I run the game and hit the pause key, our menu is starting to look a lot nicer. So the description bar is going down here. We have our options, save and close. Now this is a good start, but the pause menu doesn't really do anything useful yet. Now we want to start adding in some features where our hero can change the pizza lineup. And so we'll start adding some new options to the pause menu to do that. So back in pause menu JS here, I found the bit that we left behind saying we're going to put all of our pizzas here right before the save and close options. Let's go ahead and create those now. So I'll say lineup pizzas is going to be our player state lineup, but we're going to map through each one and transform it into one of these option configs here. Lineup is an array of strings right now, each string being an ID of a pizza. So we're going to grab the pizza ID from the pizzas database in player state. And then we're going to use that to pull out the config from our pizza decks. So the base config is going to be pizzas, passing in that pizza ID. So if we look at that just real quick, that would be like one of these, S0001, and that'll give us a reference to all of the information about Slice Samurai. So we're going to return a label, and that can be the base name, description. We have one of those too. And the handler. Now when we choose this pizza, we want to switch to sort of a details page of just this pizza. So we're going to set new options on the menu when we do that. So keyboard menu, set options. And so to get these new options, we're going to recall our get options method here, but we're going to pass in a different page key. So this dot get options, and our page key is going to be actually the ID of the pizza that we're talking about right now. So I'll just plop in ID here. That way this function will get called, but with a different input, and so we can route the logic a little bit differently. Now we can use this list here. We'll go ahead and spread it into what we're returning. Let's add some comments for clarity up here. So case 1. And then we'll come down here, add a new case. So our options per pizza are going to be 1, you can swap for any unequipped pizza. So if you own a pizza that you're not using yet, you're going to be able to swap out this one for that one. We're going to allow you to move this current pizza to the front. So rather than changing it out, it's really just changing the order of the list. We'll set up our handler for that. And then we'll allow you to go back to the previous page. So that'll be back. The handler here, we'll just rerun this method, but passing in root again. So we'll get that first initial list of options back. Let's go ahead and fill in this part now. So to get these options, we need to iterate through all the pizzas that we have that aren't in the lineup right now. So I'm going to say unequipped. We're going to iterate through all the pizzas that we know. So that's captured in pizzas. But then we want to filter those out. So basically, if this ID is found in our lineup, we don't want to include it in the list. So we'll say player state.lineup.index of this ID should be -1, meaning it's not in the array. We'll map through each of these and get our base pizza just like we did above. Then we can return our option config. So this will be swap for, use our ES6 templating guys here. So swap for the name of this pizza. For a description, we can use the description of the pizza. And then our handler will basically do the operation in player state and then update the menu. We'll get back to this part in a second. Let's go ahead and include these options in the list here. So we'll spread it in. And if we pop open to player state, we currently only have 2 pizzas and they're both in the lineup. So what would it be like if we added a third? So P3, this one is going to be, let's see, let's pick out a different pizza. How about this one? F001, Portobello Express. We'll use that for the pizza ID, and we won't include it in the lineup here. So now when we run the game, what we're expecting to see is in the first page, we'll have a list of our equipped pizzas in that lineup. But then when we choose one of those, we'll see a different list of options that allows us to do things with that pizza, like move it or swap it for an unequipped one. So let's try this out. Now when I pause the game, I see I get my pizza options here, and they line up with the HUD here. So Slice Samurai, Call Me Kale, these 2 are still here also. I'll choose Slice Samurai, and now our options, as expected, switch out. So I can swap for Portobello Express, or I can move it to the front. We haven't actually wired up the handlers to do anything yet. We'll do that next. And I can go back, and this should work. Cool. And the same thing is true for Call Me Kale. I get the same options. So now we just need to implement the functionality for actually swapping the pizza or moving it to the front. And when we do either of those things, we also want to make sure that our HUD up here updates. So let's start with the player state operations. So we're going to create some new methods on player state that we can call from these handlers. So I'll go to player state, and down here, we'll make one called move to front, and then also one called swap lineup. So swap lineup is going to operate on this array here. What we want to do is find the old ID, the one that should be removed from the lineup, and then replace it with a new ID. So we'll say old ID and incoming ID. We'll find the old index. We'll take the lineup at that index and simply set it to be the incoming ID. And that's enough to change the internal state of player state here. But now we need to notify the HUD that something is updated. So for that, we'll use our utils emit event helper. This thing has really come in handy. And we'll make a new event called lineup changed. And then when we implement this, we'll also call that down here. So now the HUD can listen for this. So let's pop open HUD. And in the previous video, we set up this event listener for player state updated. We're going to make a different one. The names of these didn't really age well, I guess, but that's okay. So when lineup is changed, we basically want to refresh all the pizzas that we see in the HUD. And so to do that, we can call this create element again, and that'll create all new DOM nodes in the right order and wire them up and all that. And then once we have a new element container, we can append it. We may have some stale stuff going on though. So when we create an element, we want to go ahead and clean up any elements that were there before, since this can now be called more than once. So if we have an element, let's remove it to clean up any old ones, and then also reset the scoreboards list back to empty. So this should be set up and ready to go. Let's go ahead and actually start calling that new player state method that we created. So here when we're swapping, we'll say player state dot swap lineup, and we want the old key first. That's going to be the pizza page that we're on now. So that's going to be page key. And then we want to swap it in with the ID of the one that we're iterating through right now. So the second argument here will be ID. And then when this happens, we can go ahead and change our menu page back to the root. So we'll do our trusty set options here. Again, just recalling the same function with the root, just like the go back option does. So let's fire this up and see it working. So I'll pause the game, slice samurai. I want to swap for Portobello Express. So when I choose that one, you can see that I'm back in the pause menu now and our options have changed. So the lineup is updated here correctly. And then also our HUD listened to that signal that was fired, and now this is in sync also. And now even when I start a battle, you see that Portobello Express is used first. So that came together pretty nicely. Let's go ahead and work on the second option now, where we can move this pizza to the front of the list. So pause menu, let's find our move to front option. We're gonna go ahead and swap the order, and whenever we're done with that, we can do the same thing where we reset to the home page to see the new order. Here, let's go ahead and call our player state dot, let's see, what do we call it? Player state move to front method. We want to pass in an ID that we want to move to the front. That's going to be the pizza that we're on now. So the ID of that one is page key. Let's go ahead and add the logic for this now. So move to front. We're going to take in a future front ID. And first we're going to remove this ID from our existing list. And then we'll pop it into the front. So this dot lineup, we'll use unshift to add it to the front. So we'll be left with a new array that has the same length, but whatever was passed in will now be at the front. And I believe this is all set up and should be working. So let's go ahead and fire it up. I'll choose the second one in the lineup, call me Kale. I'll move to front. And you can see that the order has swapped here. The order is swapped here as well. So call me Kale will now come out first in battle because it's the first in the lineup. So I'll unpause so we can see that. Go into battle here. And call me Kale's up first. And just like that, we have a functioning pause menu. So in the grand scheme of things, we were able to get this pause menu working pretty quickly. You can really take this pattern and run with it as far as making other changes to player state. Like if you want to use an item on the fly and have that apply to your pizzas, you could do that in the pause menu. Say you wanted to add a skill tree feature, like if you wanted to unlock new attacks per pizza, you could use the same menu pattern for that and then apply those changes to player state. This pattern has worked really well for me, so I'm excited to see what you do with it. That's all for this one. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to like the video and subscribe to see the whole thing. Join us in Discord, tell us about your game project, and be sure to check out the link below for supporting this channel directly. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.